Ambassador Ket Varian had sent the warning 3 years earlier, and no one had listened. Now he stood in the scorched observation dome of what had once been the Thessary Dominion's crown world, watching the last standing spire of the Grand Palace collapse into a column of grey ash, and he found he had no strength left to say, "I told you so." Behind him, General Orsk Malveth, the man who had personally overruled every word of Ket's warning, stared at the devastation with the hollow expression of someone watching his entire understanding of the universe burn alongside the city. "It doesn't make sense," Orsk said, his voice raw. "One human colony ship, one. We had 40,000 warriors garrisoned on this world. We had orbital defense grids that survived the Cretan Wars intact. How does one colony ship do this?" Ket closed his eyes. He had asked himself the same question for 3 years, ever since his diplomatic posting on the human world of New Meridian had taught him something the rest of the galaxy refused to believe. "Because you never asked what they were protecting, General. You only asked what they had, and by the time you understood the difference, it was already too late to matter." Orsk turned to him, something between fury and desperation in his eyes. "Then tell me now. Tell me what we missed." Ket looked out over the ruins of an empire that had ruled 41 star systems for 300 years, and began at last to explain 3 days earlier. The Thessary Dominion had never lost a war it chose to fight, and that, more than anything, was the source of its downfall. 3 centuries of unbroken conquest had convinced the Dominion's leadership of a single unshakable truth: that any species too young, too small, or too underdeveloped to field a proper navy was, by definition, not a threat worth taking seriously. Ambassador Ket Varian had spent 4 years as the Dominion's cultural liaison to New Meridian, a modest human colony world on the galactic frontier, with a population of less than 1 million, and no standing military fleet to speak of. He had gone there expecting to catalog a curiosity, an interesting but ultimately minor species for the Dominion's growing archive of subject worlds. What he found instead unsettled him in ways he struggled, even now, to fully articulate. Humans on New Meridian did not build for conquest. They built for endurance. Every structure, every system, every piece of technology, Ket observed, carried the unmistakable signature of a species that had learned, through hard and bitter experience, that survival was never guaranteed and had to be earned through preparation rather than assumed through strength. "They have no navy," he'd told the Dominion War Council upon his return, "because they've built something they consider more important: redundancy. Every system on that colony has 3 backups. Every citizen over the age of 16 has basic emergency and combat training. They don't plan for victory, General Malveth. They plan for the worst day imaginable, and they make sure that day never catches them unprepared." General Orsk Malveth, who had commanded Dominion forces through 11 successful campaigns, had laughed. Not cruelly, but with the genuine amusement of a man who could not imagine a threat he hadn't already conquered. "Ambassador, you're describing a farming colony with good discipline. That's admirable. It isn't dangerous." "I'm not finished," Ket had said. "There's something else, something they call their compact. Every human world, no matter how small, is bound by treaty to come to the defense of any other human world under attack. Unconditionally. Immediately. I don't believe you understand what that means." "It means," Orsk had said, "that if we ever did decide New Meridian was worth conquering, we'd have more targets to add to our list afterward." "Thank you for the intelligence, Ambassador. The Council will take it under advisement." They had not taken it under advisement. They had filed it, forgotten it, and 3 years later, when a border dispute over mining rights in the New Meridian system escalated into open conflict, the Dominion had attacked without a second thought. But no one expected what happened next. The initial assault should have been decisive. 12 Dominion warships descended on New Meridian's modest orbital defenses, expecting the kind of swift capitulation that had ended 40 other campaigns before it. Instead, they found a colony that evacuated its population to deep bunkers within 11 minutes of the first shots fired, absorbed the bombardment with a resilience that baffled Dominion tactical analysts, and transmitted a single message to the invading fleet before going dark. This is New Meridian Colony Authority. Under the terms of the Sol Compact, this attack has been logged and broadcast to all signatory worlds. You have made an enemy of every human colony in known space. We suggest you consider whether that was worth a mining dispute. General Orsk Malveth, reviewing the transmission from his flagship, had dismissed it as bravado, the desperate posturing of a species with nothing left to lose. He ordered a second wave of bombardment, intending to finish what the first had started. What he did not know, what Ket Varian had tried, and failed, to make him understand, was that the Sol Compact was not posturing. It was the single most binding piece of human interstellar law, forged in the aftermath of Earth's own devastating wars, when humanity had learned at catastrophic cost what happened to a species that let its worlds fall, one at a time. Everything changed in the next few seconds. Within 6 hours of New Meridian's distress signal reaching compact relay networks, the first response fleet arrived. Not from Earth, which lay weeks away even at maximum warp, but from 3 neighboring human colonies that had spent decades quietly building rapid response capabilities specifically for a scenario like this one. It was smaller than the Dominion's occupying force. It was also, Orsk realized within the first 10 minutes of engagement, built entirely differently. Dominion warships were designed around a doctrine of overwhelming firepower, delivered from maximum safe distance, a strategy perfected across 3 centuries of fighting species that could not match their range or armor. The human response fleet ignored range advantages almost entirely, closing to knife fighting distances where Dominion shields, optimized for long-range bombardment, proved far less effective against precision strikes, targeting critical systems rather than raw hull integrity. Impossible, Orsk muttered, watching 2 of his cruisers lose primary weapons within minutes of engagement. Their ships are a fraction of our tonnage. They're not fighting our ships, General, his tactical officer said grimly. They're fighting our doctrine, and it seems they've studied it far more carefully than we ever studied them. Nobody knew what the human was hiding. What the Dominion discovered, in the brutal weeks that followed, was that the Sol Compact was not merely a treaty of mutual defense. It was the foundation of an entire civilizational philosophy. Humanity, scattered across dozens of colonies since Earth's own near-collapse centuries earlier, had built its interstellar identity not around conquest, but around the unbreakable principle that no human world would ever again face annihilation alone. Every colony contributed, every colony trained, resources, technology, and expertise flowed continuously between worlds, not through central command, but through a web of mutual obligation forged from a shared and desperate history. It meant that attacking any single human world, no matter how small or undefended it appeared, meant eventually facing the accumulated strength of all of them. Ket Varian, watching the campaign unfold from a Dominion command post, increasingly desperate for answers, found himself in the strange position of being the only person in the room who wasn't surprised. "You had 3 years to prepare for this," he told General Malveth, during one of the tensest strategy sessions of the war. "I gave you every piece of information you needed to avoid it entirely." "You gave me a report about farming colonies and treaties," Orsk snapped. "You didn't tell me they'd bring an entire species to our doorstep over a mining dispute." "I told you they don't measure strength the way we do," Ket said. "You didn't listen, because it didn't fit anything you already believed about how wars are won." That wasn't even the biggest surprise. What surprised General Malveth most, in the weeks that followed, was not the strength of the human fleet but the composition of it. He had expected soldiers, hardened, disciplined warriors bred for exactly this kind of campaign. Instead, intelligence reports revealed that nearly a third of the response fleet's crews were civilian volunteers, engineers, teachers, farmers from a dozen different colonies who had spent years training in their off hours, specifically because the compact required every citizen to be ready, not just those who chose soldiering as a profession. "They don't have a warrior class," Ket explained, when Orsk demanded to know how untrained colonists had inflicted such precise, coordinated damage on veteran Dominion crews. "They have a warrior culture. Every one of them. It's woven into how they raise their children, how they structure their governments, how they decide what kind of world is worth defending. You were fighting a species where the difference between soldier and citizen is a matter of which shift they happened to be working when the alarm sounded. Orsk said nothing for a long moment, watching the tactical display update with another lost position. Then we were never fighting an army at all. No, Ket said quietly, you were fighting a civilization that decided, generations ago, that it would rather be ready for a war it hoped would never come than comfortable, in the belief that it never would. The Council had made a terrible mistake. By the time the Dominion War Council finally authorized full withdrawal, 6 months, thousands of casualties, and 4 lost worlds into a war that should never have started. The damage had metastasized far beyond New Meridian. Word of the Dominion's brutal opening bombardment had spread through every corner of compact space, and human colonies, that had spent decades quietly building their defensive infrastructure, now had the one thing they'd always lacked: a unifying cause and an enemy the entire compact agreed was worth confronting. The final battle came not at New Meridian, but at the Dominion's own crown world, where a combined human fleet, drawn from 11 different colonies, none of which had ever fought together before this war, arrived not for conquest, but with a demand disguised as an ultimatum: withdraw all forces from every disputed system, dismantle the military infrastructure responsible for the New Meridian bombardment, and submit to compact oversight of any future contact with human space. General Orsk Malveth, standing on the bridge of his flagship as the human fleet assembled in formation above his homeworld, understood at last the full weight of what Kat Varion had tried to warn him about 3 years earlier. They're not here to conquer us, he said quietly. No, Ket agreed. They're here to make sure you never make this mistake again. There's a difference, General, and it's the only difference that ever mattered. The truth stunned the entire galaxy. The Dominion's surrender terms, when they finally came, shocked every neighboring power watching the conflict unfold. Humanity did not seize Dominion territory. It did not demand tribute, or reparations beyond the cost of rebuilding New Meridian, or the kind of crushing subjugation the Dominion itself had inflicted on 40 other worlds across 3 centuries of conquest. Instead, the Compact's final demand was almost unsettling in its simplicity: full diplomatic transparency, permanent Compact observation rights over Dominion military development, and a formal, galaxy-wide acknowledgement of the Sol Compact's founding principle, that any attack on one human world would always, without exception, become an attack on all of them. Ambassador Ket Varion, standing once more in the scorched ruins of the Grand Palace months later, watched the last Dominion banners come down and felt something he hadn't expected. Not triumph, but a quiet, exhausted relief that the warning he'd given 3 years earlier had finally, if catastrophically late, been understood. You could have destroyed us entirely, Orsk said, joining him amid the ashes. You had the fleet. You had the cause. The galaxy would have called it justice. We could have, Ket said, having spent enough time among humans now to understand their answer before he asked the question. But that's not what the Compact was built to do. It was built to make sure worlds like New Meridian never burn again. Not to make sure the Dominion does instead. He looked out over the ruined skyline, where reconstruction crews from a dozen different worlds, Dominion and human both, had already begun the long work of rebuilding, and understood, at last, the lesson the galaxy had ignored for 3 years and would never be allowed to forget again: that the deadliest thing about humanity was never its strength, but its unwillingness to let a single one of its own stand alone. Somewhere behind them, a young Dominion engineer laid the first new support beam across the fallen archway of the Grand Palace, working shoulder to shoulder with a human volunteer who had crossed half the galaxy to help rebuild a world she had once been sent to burn. Neither of them spoke the other's language fluently yet. Neither of them needed to. The lesson, by then, had already been learned by everyone who mattered.